The knock came at 10:47 on a Tuesday night. I remember the time exactly because I was staring at the clock when I heard it. One of those odd moments where your brain decides to lock onto a detail. The knock was firm but not aggressive, not demanding, just a knock. 3 raps on the door. I was in the middle of a documentary about deep sea creatures, something mindless I'd thrown on to fill the silence that comes with living alone. I almost didn't answer. It was late. It was raining outside. But something made me get up from the couch, made me walk across the darkened living room to the door. I remember my hand hesitating on the knob. How many times in your life do you hesitate before opening a door? Usually it's nothing, just a delivery driver or a neighbour. But sometimes your body knows something before your mind catches up. I opened the door, and he was standing there, soaking wet, rain dripping from his dark hair, his clothes plastered to his frame. He was tall, around 6 feet, with broad shoulders and a face that was familiar and foreign all at once. He didn't speak right away. He just stood there looking at me with an intensity I couldn't quite place. And then he said it. "Dad, it's been a long time. Long." My first instinct was to deny it, to say he had the wrong house, the wrong person. But I didn't, because standing in front of me, drenched and shaking, was a man who looked exactly like my son looked the day he vanished 28 years ago. Not like he would look now, like he looked then, like he was 12 years old trapped in a 40-year-old's body. My name is Robert, and I'm 53 years old. I spent most of my working life as an engineer, nothing glamorous, just structural design for buildings and bridges, the kind of work where you solve problems on paper and hope they don't cause catastrophes in the real world. I live alone now, have for about 5 years since my wife Margaret died. We had one child, Michael, born in 1996. He disappeared on October 14th, 2008. He was 12 years old. That fact has defined every single day of my life since then, whether I acknowledged it or not. After Margaret passed, I retired early from my firm. I was good at what I did, but work stopped feeling important. Everything stopped feeling important except the weight of all that time. All those years where I kept waiting for something that never came. I moved into a smaller house. I went to therapy for a while. Stopped going when the therapist started talking about acceptance and closure, words that felt like betrayals. My daughter-in-law, though I never had a daughter-in-law, would have been Michael's wife by now, or maybe not. Maybe he would have wanted to travel, become an artist, do something completely different than what I imagined for him when he was 12. But imagination is all I've had. Imagination and photographs. Dozens of them. Michael's school photos with that awkward smile he had in the 6th grade. Michael at his birthday party, holding a homemade chocolate cake Margaret had made with too much frosting. Michael in his soccer uniform looking proud because he'd scored his first goal that season. I kept those photos, in a box upstairs in my office. I didn't look at them often anymore. The pain had calcified into something more like a permanent ache, something you learn to live with the way you learn to live with arthritis or old war injuries. The thing about losing a child is that it's not one moment of grief. It's 1,000 moments. It's seeing a boy his age at the grocery store and feeling your chest tighten. It's hearing a certain song on the radio and remembering he liked that song. It's waking up sometimes in the middle of the night disoriented, thinking maybe it was all a nightmare, and then remembering that it's not. I need to tell you about the day he disappeared because it's important to understand why a man appears at my door looking exactly like he did then and why that matters. It was a Tuesday, October 14th, 2008. Michael had school. It was his last period before lunch when he called me at work. I remember because I had my phone on my desk and his name came up on the screen. Michael. Not many kids called their parents during school. I almost didn't answer, but I did. "Hey Dad," he said. I could hear the noise of the hallway in the background, kids shouting, lockers slamming. "What's up, are you okay?" I asked. There was something in his voice I couldn't quite identify. Not distress exactly, but something off. Yeah, I'm fine, I'm great actually. Listen, don't come pick me up after school today, okay? I'm going to stay after for the math club. Mr. Henderson is doing that competition prep thing, remember? I told you about it." I tried to remember. Had he told me? Maybe. Michael was smart, especially in math. 12 going on 20 in his head, the teacher said. Okay, sure. What time do you need a pickup? I asked. Actually, maybe Tommy's dad can grab me. We're carpooling anyway. Or I could just walk home. It's only like 2 miles. My wife always said I was overprotective. Maybe I was. But I didn't like the idea of a 12-year-old walking alone. "Let me call Tommy's dad," I said. "I'll confirm with you by 2 o'clock if the carpool doesn't work." "Sure, Dad. Thanks." He hung up. That was the last time I heard my son's voice. Tommy's father never picked Michael up that day. Tommy himself said Michael never showed up at the math club, and when I called the school at 3:30 because I hadn't heard from anyone, the secretary told me they'd had an early dismissal. No math club, no meeting. Just an ordinary Tuesday afternoon where Michael should have been home at 3 o'clock and wasn't. Margaret got home from work at 5. She was a nurse, and she'd been finishing up a shift at the hospital. I was already panicking, pacing the kitchen, making phone calls. I'd called Tommy's house, Michael's best friend Daniel's house, his teacher Mr. Henderson, who said there was no math club that day, no competition prep. My son had lied to me. My son had lied and disappeared. I remember Margaret's face when I told her. The colour just drained out of it. We both stood there in the kitchen, and I could see her doing the math in her head the same way I was. Last known contact, 10:47 a.m, current time, 5:15 p.m, 7.5 hours. 7.5 hours with no idea where he was or why he'd lied about after-school plans. By 6 p.m, we'd called the police. By 8 p.m, Officer Catherine Wells was standing in our living room taking a report. She was good at her job, methodical, and she asked all the right questions. Was Michael having problems at school? No. Was he involved with drugs or gang activity? No. Had he been acting strangely? Not that we noticed. Had he mentioned anyone new in his life? Anyone who might be a concern? Not that we were aware of. She took his photo. She asked for details about what he was wearing, physical distinguishing marks as his habits. We told her about the scar on his left knee from a skateboarding accident when he was 10. We told her about the birthmark on his right shoulder blade. We told her things you shouldn't have to tell anyone about your child, but you do when they go missing. By the next morning, his photo was in the newspaper. By that evening, it was on the local news. By Friday, the police had brought in a dog unit to search the woods near the school. The dogs found nothing. The investigation lasted 6 months in an intensive way, and then it petered out. Detectives Wells and Morrison, her partner, did their jobs. They interviewed everyone. They checked Michael's phone records. There was nothing unusual. A few texts to Daniel and Tommy about homework. A few chats about video games. Nothing that suggested he was in contact with anyone dangerous or that he was planning to run away. The closest they came to a lead was 3 weeks in when someone reported seeing a boy fitting Michael's description at a truck stop 70 miles away. The detectives drove out there, showed photos to people, talked to state police in 3 different states. Nothing panned out. As months turned into years, the case went cold. Not abandoned exactly, but deprioritized. Detective Wells kept in touch. She'd call on Michael's birthday, on the anniversary of his disappearance. She'd say things like, "We haven't forgotten, and we're still looking." But I could hear the weight of disappointment in her voice. She had hundreds of cases. Michael was just one of them, and the chances of finding a missing child after 6 months were statistically very low. I learned a lot about statistics in those years. I learned that most missing children are runaways who come back within 48 hours. I learned that some never come back. I learned that parents of missing children have a very high rate of suicide and mental breakdown, a fact the support group I briefly attended was always careful to mention delicately. Margaret and I went to the support group. Once. We sat in a circle with other people who had lost children, and everyone shared their story. A girl missing for 2 years. A boy taken from a parking lot. A teenager who went for a drive and never came home. We listened to their pain and we added ours to it, and then we left and never went back. It felt like admitting defeat, like we were joining a club for people whose lives had been permanently broken. Investigations are slow and tedious. Michael's case had nothing solid. No eyewitness, no ransom demand. Just a boy who lied and vanished. People ask if we thought he was alive. Margaret believed it for years. "He's out there somewhere," she'd say. "Someone has him." I wavered. Some days he ran away. Some days he was dead. Detective Wells retired in 2015, and I never heard from anyone again. I assumed the case was closed, filed away, one more statistic. I assumed my son was gone, and had to learn to live with that. When I finally stepped back from the door and let him into the house, I was shaking. I told myself it was the shock of seeing someone standing there so late at night, the shock of hearing words no father expects to hear after 28 years. But it was more than that. It was the impossible made physical. He stood in my hallway dripping rainwater onto the carpet, and I couldn't move. "I know this is strange," he said. His voice was deeper than Michael's had been, of course. Deeper and more measured, controlled. "I know this is going to be hard to believe. I barely believe it myself." He held up his hands, palms out in a peaceful gesture. "I need you to listen to me. Really listen, because what I'm about to tell you is going to sound insane." I gestured toward the living room, still not trusting myself to speak. He followed me. We sat down on opposite ends of the couch, and he looked at me with eyes that were so familiar it hurt. Light brown, with a slight downturn on the outer edge. Michael's eyes. He had Michael's eyes. "My name is Michael," he said. "Michael Robert Chen. I was born on March 3rd, 1996. You and Mum named me Michael because you wanted me to have a strong name, something that meant something. My mother's maiden name was Zhang. She called me Mikey sometimes when I was very small, even though you didn't like pet names. I had a scar on my left knee from a skateboarding accident. I liked math and science. I wanted to be an engineer like you. I had a best friend named Daniel who I made a pact with in 4th grade to become rich and open a restaurant together. I loved your wife's cooking, especially her pot stickers. I was supposed to have a girlfriend named Sarah that fall, but I was too nervous to ask her out even though all my friends said she liked me. I disappeared on October 14th, 2008, and I've been gone for 28 years, Dad. I've been gone and I don't know how to explain where I've been or how I'm here now, and I'm terrified you're going to think I'm a fraud or a psychopath, or that you're going to try to turn me in for whatever crime or prank this might look like. But I'm telling you that I'm your son, and I need you to believe me." I listened to him, and I felt reality start to fracture. A rational person would have been skeptical. A rational person would have demanded proof, would have called the police, would have assumed this was some kind of elaborate con. But I'm not always rational, and I haven't been for 28 years. I'd kept that box of photos. I'd marked his birthday every year. I'd never taken his name off the insurance policy. Part of me had been waiting for something impossible to happen. "If you're really Michael," I heard myself say, "then you need to tell me something only Michael would know. Something I've never told anyone." He nodded slowly. "The last thing you said to me when you dropped me off at school that morning, you told me to have a good day and to remember my homework. But then you said something else. You said, 'Michael, you're going to do something great someday. I know it.' And I was annoyed because it was cheesy and I was 12 and I didn't want my dad being sentimental. But I never told anyone that. Mum didn't know you said that. My friends didn't know. No one knows." I felt the room tilt that morning. That stupid moment where I'd wanted my son to know that I believed in him. It was just a nothing moment. No witnesses. No one there but us. How could he possibly know that? I stood up abruptly and he flinched. "I need to verify something," I said. My voice sounded strange, distant. "Sit here. Don't move." I went upstairs to my office. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely open the filing cabinet. But I found it. The box with all the photos and documents. I pulled out Michael's school records, his dental charts, his pediatric files. I came back downstairs and spread everything out on the coffee table between us. "I need you to answer some questions," I said. "Detailed questions, because if you're really my son, you'll remember things, specific things, personal things." For the next 2 hours, I questioned him. I asked him about the childhood I'd given him, the memories we'd made. He answered every question with a precision that was both terrifying and gradually, inevitably convincing. He remembered the summer we went to the lake and he fell off the dock, and I had to jump in after him, and Marcus, who was my work friend at the time, had laughed and said I'd always be an overprotective father. He remembered the Christmas when he was 9, and Margaret made his favourite dessert and I fell asleep in the middle of the family movie, and he remembered exactly which movie it was because it made him so angry that I'd missed the ending. He remembered his teacher's name in 5th grade, Mrs. Patterson. He remembered his second best friend before Daniel was a girl named Sophie. He remembered everything in a way that no imposter could possibly know. But it wasn't just the memories. It was the way he talked about things, the emotion he put into certain recollections. When he talked about his birthday that year, the excitement and the waiting and the anticipation of growing older, I could hear the voice of a 12-year-old coming through the body of a grown man, and he cried when I showed him the photos. He looked at pictures of his mother and he wept. "I didn't know if she was still alive," he said. "I didn't know if either of you were. I didn't know if coming back would destroy everything or if there was anything left to come back to. I told him about Margaret. I told him she'd died 5 years ago, that she'd never given up hope, that she'd gone to her grave thinking about him. He wept harder at that. I need to show you something, I finally said. I pulled my phone out and called my brother David, who lived upstairs in a condo complex and would still be awake. I asked him to come to my house right now, told him it was important. I didn't explain. I couldn't. David was there in 10 minutes, letting himself in with the spare key. He stopped short when he saw Michael sitting on my couch. The resemblance was undeniable. David had known Michael, had done the uncle thing, had attended birthday parties and school plays and everything else that came with being an uncle. David looked at me, confused, waiting for an explanation. David, this is going to sound insane, I said. This is my son. This is Michael. My brother stared. That's not funny, he said. Michael was taken in 2008. Michael pulled up his sleeve and showed us his left arm. There, on his shoulder, was the birthmark. A small crescent-shaped mark, the colour of old rust. The birthmark I remembered from when he was born, when the nurse had pointed it out and said it would probably fade, but it hadn't. The birthmark that Margaret and I had talked about when he was a baby, how it made him look distinguished, how it was like a mark of destiny or something. The same birthmark that no amount of research could tell me how a stranger would know about unless Michael had lived his entire life wearing it. David's face went pale. That's impossible, he whispered. He walked closer to Michael, staring at the birthmark like it might vanish if he looked away. I remember that mark. I remember you showing it to me when you were, 6 years old? You asked me if it meant you were special. I told you it meant you were unique. He looked at me. I never told anyone about that conversation. I didn't even think about it until right now. Michael looked at David and said softly, You said I was unique and I could be anything I wanted to be. I thought you meant the birthmark gave me superpowers. At that, David sat down hard on the couch. He covered his face with his hands. This is real, he said. This is actually happening. I went through the house that night in a daze, gathering more evidence, or perhaps more accurately, gathering more proof of what I already wanted to believe. Michael showed us scars, we remembered. A thin line on his right hand from when he caught his hand on a fence while climbing, a small indentation on his forehead from when he fell off his bike at age 7. I took him to the bathroom and showed him photos on my phone of his mother, and he stood there in the pale bathroom light and cried like his heart was being torn out of his chest all over again. David called his wife Sharon, told her to come over, that something impossible had happened. By midnight, Sharon was there, and Michael went through the same questions with her, remembering her maiden name, remembering the time she took him, to get ice cream after school when his father was working late, remembering the flavour he ordered and the fact that she'd let him lick her cone because he was envious of hers. Sharon wept. By 2 a.m., I'd run through everything I could think of. I showed him his old school yearbooks. I showed him photos from his birthday parties. I showed him his growth chart on the kitchen wall that Margaret had kept. Those pencil marks measuring his progress from year to year, all stopped at a height of 5'3", the height he'd been when he was 12. And then I looked at him, this man who bore my son's face, this impossible thing standing in my kitchen at 2 a.m, and I said the thing I'd been afraid to say. Michael, where have you been? How are you here? What happened to you? He looked at me with an expression so exhausted, so beaten down by the weight of whatever truth he was carrying, that I almost didn't want to hear the answer. I don't know, he said. That's the honest truth, Dad. I don't know where I've been or how I'm here. I remember lying down on the grass near the school that day. I remember the sky was blue. I remember thinking about asking Sarah to the dance, and then nothing. And then I woke up and I was 40 years old and my hands looked like this, and there were grey hairs in my beard and I had no idea what had happened to me. I was standing in a parking lot somewhere near the highway, and I didn't know where I was or how I'd gotten there or what year it was. I found a newspaper and it told me it was 2036. I found a smartphone, which was so different from what I remembered that I spent an hour just trying to figure out how to use it. And then I found information about you, about this address. And I drove here because I had to know if you were still alive, if any of this was still real. He sat down at the kitchen table and looked at his hands like they belonged to someone else. I don't know what happened to me, Dad, but I know that I'm your son. I know that I love you, and I know that I needed to come home. David left around 3 a.m. after making us both promise we wouldn't do anything crazy before we called him in the morning. Sharon hugged Michael for a long time before they left, and I heard her whispering to David in the hallway, It's him. I don't know how, I don't know why, but it's him. I know my nephew." When they were gone, Michael and I sat in the living room as the sky began to lighten on the horizon. He was still wearing his wet clothes from the rain. I offered him some of my clothes, but he refused. He said he wanted to remember this night exactly as it was, wanted to remember the feeling of the cold fabric clinging to him, because it meant he was real, that this was happening. I sat there, and I looked at my son, this man who had my eyes, my chin, my voice filtered through years of living I couldn't comprehend. "What do we do now?" I asked. "I don't know," he said. "I don't know if anyone will believe us. I don't know if the authorities will try to arrest me or study me or declare this some kind of hoax. I just know I had to come back. I had to know if you would remember me. I had to know if love survives time itself. Mayan dur." And that's when I realized something. In all my years of waiting, in all my years of wondering what had happened to my son, I'd never once imagined this. I'd imagined him returning as a man traumatized by whatever had happened. I'd imagined him returning with memories of captivity or a long journey home, but I'd never imagined he would return unchanged inside. The same scared, hopeful, desperate 12-year-old kid who'd lied about math club so he could figure out something he needed to figure out, now trapped in a body that had aged in ways his mind couldn't explain. But as I sat there watching the sun rise, I realized that the mysteries didn't matter anymore. The how and the why and the where could all wait. What mattered was that he was here. What mattered was that my son had come home. Sirsigiru. What mattered was that I finally had proof that hope isn't always foolish. Sometimes, if you wait long enough, if you believe hard enough, the impossible actually happens. By the time the sun had fully risen, I'd made coffee. Michael drank it black the way I do. I noticed that and filed it away somewhere in my mind, a small piece of evidence among the mounting pile. He told me more as we sat in the kitchen light, details that seemed to pour out of him like he'd been holding them back. He talked about being in the parking lot near the highway, how he'd woken up in complete disorientation. He'd spent hours just trying to understand what a smartphone was, scrolling through news articles about the year 2036, the technological changes, the way the world had evolved in 28 years. He described the panic, the absolute terror of not knowing how much time had passed, of seeing images of flying cars and talking computers and a world that looked like science fiction. Action. He talked about finding my address through an online directory, how he'd driven to the city and sat in his car for 3 hours before he had the courage to knock on my door. He told me he'd been living in a motel for the past week, just trying to collect himself, trying to figure out if he actually had the right person, or if he was having some kind of breakdown. He said he'd gone to the library and researched me, found articles about my engineering firm, about my retirement. He'd seen my house in a real estate database from years ago. "I wasn't sure you'd still be alive," he said. "I wasn't sure you'd want to see me. I wasn't sure if anything I remembered was real, or if I was just insane. Part of me thought maybe I'd imagined the whole thing, that I was actually in a psychiatric hospital somewhere, and this was all some kind of elaborate delusion." He ran his hands through his hair, and I saw how his fingers trembled. "But I knew I had to try. If there was even a chance that you were real, that this was real, I had to know. I listened to all of it, and I wanted to believe it. God, I wanted to believe it. But there was a part of me, the part that had spent 28 years as a rational engineer, that was already starting to ask questions. David had left his phone number and asked me to call him as soon as Michael told me anything else of substance. Sharon had hugged me at the door and whispered, "Just be careful, Robert. I know this seems real, but just be careful." I hadn't known what she meant at the time. Now, as Michael sat across from me in the morning light, I was beginning to understand. There was an inconsistency, a small one, the kind of thing you almost don't notice unless you're specifically looking for it. He'd said he woke up in a parking lot near the highway, but then he said he'd been living in a motel for a week, which meant he'd been conscious and functioning for a week before coming to see me. He'd had time to think. He'd had time to plan. He'd had access to information about me, about the world. And he'd chosen to come tonight in the rain, soaking wet, like he was trying to manufacture urgency or sympathy or something. I remembered something about Michael from when he was younger. We'd gone to the lake one summer. Maybe he was 9 or 10, and there had been a boy there who Michael wanted to impress. Michael had made up this elaborate story about how we'd seen an Osprey dive bomb a fish that morning, which was completely false. Margaret and I had been in the kitchen the entire morning. When I had asked him about it later, he'd admitted he just wanted the other boy to think we were interesting. He'd lied to seem more impressive. Michael had always been a bright kid, but he was also a kid. Kids lie. Kids manipulate. They don't always mean anything by it, but they do it. This thought stuck with me as I watched my supposed son drink his coffee. I thought about another time when he was 7 and he'd come home, here from school saying he'd won a spelling bee, which he hadn't. The teacher had called and gently corrected the story. Margaret had handled it perfectly, matter of fact, explaining that lying doesn't make you look bigger, it just makes you smaller. Michael had cried about that for an hour. He'd always been sensitive to criticism, wanting desperately to be seen as capable and impressive. It was a vulnerability I recognised in myself. What if this man had seen all those things in me too? What if he'd seen a grieving father desperate for closure and shaped himself into exactly what I needed to see? What if the real Michael somewhere was still 12 years old and gone? These thoughts were poison, but I couldn't stop them from spreading through my mind. I excused myself and went upstairs. I called David from my bedroom, keeping my voice low even though Michael was downstairs and couldn't possibly hear me over the sound of the kitchen faucet running. "He's been conscious for a week," I told David. "He didn't come straight here. He's been in a motel somewhere." "So what?" David said. "Maybe he was trying to process everything. Maybe he was scared." "Or maybe he was planning," I said. "Maybe he was preparing a story." David was silent for a moment. "Robert, you're spiralling. You've been waiting for your son for 28 years. Don't let paranoia ruin this." But it wasn't paranoia. It was the same instinct that had made me good at structural design, the ability to see where something might fail, where the weight-bearing points were weakest. I hung up and sat on the edge of my bed. I thought about Michael as he'd been, not as a 40-year-old man with his face, but as a real, living, breathing boy. I thought about the summer he was 8 and we'd gone camping. Margaret had packed his favourite sandwiches, peanut butter and jam, not cut diagonally because Michael said the triangles tasted different from the rectangles and he wanted rectangles. I'd laughed at his specific logic. He'd been so serious about it, so adamant that this detail mattered. We'd set up the tent by a small lake and Michael had wanted to swim immediately, but the water was too cold. He'd waded in up to his ankles and declared it not suitable for human habitation. Margaret had made hot chocolate on the camp stove and we'd sat in lawn chairs watching the sunset. The mosquitoes had been terrible that night, and Margaret had covered Michael in bug spray while he complained about the smell. She'd kissed the top of his head anyway. Michael had asked me questions about the stars, which constellations were which, how far away they were. I'd tried my best to answer, admitting when I didn't know something. "It's okay not to know everything, Dad," Michael had said, which had struck me as wise for an 8-year-old. He'd held Margaret's hand as we walked back to the tent, and I'd felt a sense of completeness then, a sense that this was what life was supposed to be. The sound of his voice, the smell of pine and campfire smoke and the insect repellent Margaret had sprayed on his small body. The weight of his hand in mine on the walk back to our tent. I hadn't thought about that camping trip in years. After he's disappeared, remembering was too painful. It had felt like torture to hold those moments in my mind, to know they were all I would ever have of my son, but now, 33 years later, I was desperate to cling to them, to use them as some kind of measuring stick for whether the man downstairs was real or if he was a carefully constructed fiction designed to prey on everything I'd lost. I came back downstairs and looked at this man who might or might not be my son, and I realised that remembering was going to be part of whatever this was. I was going to have to wade through every moment with Michael, checking it against this new version of him, trying to determine where the truth ended and something else began. After breakfast, I did something I'd been avoiding. I called Detective Wells, my old contact from the police department. She'd retired 5 years ago, but I found her number in an old file with notes I'd kept from the investigation. She answered on the 3rd ring, and I could hear the surprise in her voice when I told her who I was. "Robert Chen," she said, "it's been a long time. Is this about Michael?" The fact that she remembered, that she hadn't forgotten after nearly 3 decades, somehow made this both easier and harder. She remembered Michael's case. She remembered me. She asked the right questions in the right order, and I explained the situation as best I could. A man claiming to be my son had appeared at my door Thursday night. He knew details only Michael would know. He had the same birthmark. He remembered conversations, moments, private family memories that were never documented anywhere. But there were inconsistencies. She listened without interrupting, and I could hear her breathing on the other end of the line, her cop brain processing. When I finished, there was a long pause. "Robert, that's an extraordinary claim," she said carefully. "I'm going to be honest with you, because I care about you and I don't want to see you hurt again. I've worked enough cases to know that the world is full of people who can mimic the details of missing person cases. They read about them online. They become obsessed. They convince themselves they are the missing person. They're not malicious necessarily. Some of them are mentally ill. Some of them are grifters. Some of them genuinely believe what they're saying. It happens more than you'd think." "So you think he's a fraud?" I said. My voice sounded hollow. "I think you need DNA verification before you believe anything," she said. "That's the only way to know for certain. No matter how convincing he is, no matter how much he knows, the truth is in the biology. Have him tested. A simple saliva sample. We can cross-reference with your DNA and establish paternity definitively. That's step one. Don't make any major decisions until you have that information. Don't change your will. Don't give him money. Don't tell him anything about your finances. Just get the DNA test." When I brought up the DNA test to Michael, he didn't hesitate. "Yes," he said immediately. "Whatever you need to verify this. I want you to know I'm really your son." But there was something in the way he said it. The phrasing was too perfect, too designed to sound sincere. A real person caught in this situation might have said, "Of course, that makes sense," or "Do what you have to do." But "I want you to know I'm really your son" felt like dialogue, like he was performing rather than just living the moment. He delivered it with just the right amount of hope and vulnerability, like an actor hitting his mark. That night, after Michael had gone to sleep in the guest room, I walked the halls of my own house like it was somewhere unfamiliar. I kept expecting him to emerge from the darkness, to catch me searching, to demand to know what I was doing. But he didn't. He slept like the dead, and I moved like a man trying not to disturb ghosts. I went to my office and pulled down the box of photos I hadn't looked at in years. I studied Michael's face at different ages, looking for traces of the man downstairs. There were similarities, certainly. The nose, the way his hair grew, the distinctive freckle on his right cheekbone. But there were also differences I couldn't explain. The man downstairs had deeper lines around his eyes, the kind you get from squinting or years of stress. His hands looked older, weathered by time in a way that seemed excessive even for 28 years. The calluses were in different places. Even if he'd aged 28 years, something was off. Or maybe I was looking too hard, seeing differences where none existed because I was desperately afraid of being foolish. I thought about what Sharon had said, and I began to do something I'd sworn I would never do. I began keeping a log. Small observations, nothing accusatory, just facts. Thursday night, 10:47 p.m, arrived wet. Claimed to have been living in motel for 1 week. Friday morning, 7 a.m, found him making coffee without asking where anything is kept. Saturday morning, mentioned knowing Margaret's maiden name without being told. Sunday afternoon, asked about my life insurance policy. The list grew longer, each item small and potentially meaningless, but together forming a shape I didn't want to acknowledge. The next morning I drove Michael to a pharmacy near the house. He seemed nervous for the first time since he'd arrived, his leg bouncing in the passenger seat. The girl at the counter walked us through the process, explaining that we'd need both of our samples. Michael went first, providing saliva into a small collection tube. I watched his face as he did it, looking for any sign of deception or uncertainty. But he just swallowed and handed the tube back to the technician with a slight smile. Then it was my turn. I spit into the tube and sealed it, and suddenly it felt real in a way it hadn't before. We were really doing this. We were really going to know. The technician explained that the results would take 5 to 7 business days, maybe longer depending on the lab's workload. She put both samples in a biohazard bag and told us we'd receive the results via email. 5 to 7 days. 5 to 7 days to wonder and spiral and question every memory I had. The drive home was quiet. Michael stared out the window at the trees passing, and I couldn't read anything in his expression. That afternoon, I made the mistake of searching for Michael's old case file online. There were newspaper archives, old reports, the same information I'd read 1,000 times over the years. Missing boy, no leads, case cold, parents devastated, detectives baffled, all the familiar language of a dead case. But there was one article I'd never paid close attention to before. It was from a true crime podcast called Where Are They Now? That had featured his disappearance 3 years after he went missing. They'd interviewed a woman who worked at a convenience store near the school. Her name was Betty Vasquez, and she said she remembered seeing a boy fitting Michael's description that afternoon, October 14th, 2008, talking to an older man in the parking lot behind the store. The boy had seemed reluctant. The man had been insistent, holding the boy's arm. She'd seen them get into a dark sedan. She'd almost called the police, but had convinced herself she was probably overreacting. By the time she decided to report what she'd seen, the trail had gone cold. The lead had never panned out. Police had searched for the sedan but found nothing. I printed out the article and left it on the kitchen counter without explanation. I told myself it was just sitting there, that I wasn't testing him, but I was. I absolutely was. When Michael saw it, his face went very still. He stood there for a long moment, just reading, his back to me. "Do you think that was me?" he asked quietly, and his voice sounded different, smaller. "I don't remember that," he said. "I remember the grass. I remember thinking about Sarah. I don't remember any parking lot or any man." He turned to look at me, and there was genuine confusion in his eyes. Why would someone say they saw me if it's not true? Why would they make that up? His hands were shaking as he set the article down. "Unless it was true," he continued. "Unless I was taken by someone and I don't remember any of it. What if something happened that day that I've blocked out? What if my mind has been protecting me all this time?" That was the first time I saw real fear in his eyes. The first time something seemed to crack in his presentation. Either he was a phenomenal actor, or he was genuinely disturbed by the suggestion that he'd been taken and had no memory of it. Either way, I wasn't sure what to believe anymore. My daughter-in-law Sharon had been right. I needed to be careful. Something was wrong. I could feel it in the way the house had changed since he arrived. A kind of tension in the air, like the building pressure before a storm. I started noticing other things, small behaviours that seemed off in ways I couldn't quite articulate. The way he moved around the house with too much familiarity, opening cabinets and drawers without hesitation, knowing exactly where things were kept even though I'd rearranged everything after Margaret died. Moving things to different shelves, different spaces. The way he looked at photos on my phone when he thought I wasn't watching, scrolling through my images with an intensity that seemed more than curiosity. The way he asked questions about my finances, my life insurance, whether I had a will, my retirement accounts. Small things, nothing that individually meant anything definitive. But together they formed a pattern. Or maybe they didn't. Maybe I was constructing a pattern out of nothing because I was afraid, because hope was becoming something dangerous, something that could destroy me if I let it take root in the wrong way. I remembered the days after Michael first went missing. The police had searched the school. They'd brought dogs. They'd knocked on doors in the neighbourhood. For 6 months, I'd been the man on television, pleading with whoever had taken my son to bring him home. I'd held photos of his young face and tried not to cry while cameras flashed. Margaret and I had been torn apart by the not knowing, by the endless speculation and false leads and dashed hopes. There had been a woman who claimed she'd seen him in Arizona. A man called in saying he'd spotted him on a bus heading south. All of it had led nowhere. After a while, the not knowing becomes its own kind of torture. You start to convince yourself that any answer, no matter how terrible, is better than the endless waiting. At least you could grieve if he was dead. At least you could move forward. But this endless possibility, this maybe, was worse than anything else. I'd been to support group meetings. I'd listened to other parents whose children had vanished. Some had eventually come home. Some had been found in graves. Some remained missing forever, their faces aging on milk cartons and missing person websites, suspended in time and question marks. Most of the parents in those groups looked the way I felt now, like people who had been hollowed out and were just going through the motions of living. Now, nearly 30 years later, I was feeling some of that again. That same desperate, clawing need to know no matter what the truth was. I waited for the DNA results and found myself unable to sleep. I'd lie in bed listening to Michael moving around in the guest room down the hall, listening to the water pipes when he took showers, listening to the soft sounds of him existing in my house. One night I got up at 3 a.m. and stood outside his door listening. He was awake. I could hear him moving, typing on something, maybe on his phone. He was doing something at 3 a.m. and I had no idea what. I almost knocked on the door but didn't. What would I say? What would I accuse him of? He had the right to exist in my house, to move around at night, to make phone calls or read or do whatever he wanted. Except something in me screamed that he didn't. Something in me screamed that he was an intruder. 5 business days became 6. 6 became 7. I called the lab on day 8. The technician told me the results would be available within the next 2 days. My hand shook when I hung up the phone. David called to check on me. "How are you holding up?" he asked. I told him I was fine, which was a lie. My voice sounded like I hadn't slept in a week. "Any results yet?" he asked. "Tomorrow," I said. Or maybe it was today, I couldn't keep track of time anymore. Everything had become about the waiting, about that test result that would confirm or deny everything. I found myself watching Michael more carefully, trying to see the truth written on his face, in his mannerisms, in the way he spoke about our past. But the more I watched, the less I understood, because sometimes he seemed like the boy I'd known, and sometimes he seemed like a complete stranger wearing a mask of my son's memories. And I had no way of knowing which version was true. I kept thinking about the woman at the convenience store, Betty Vasquez, who claimed she'd seen Michael getting into a dark sedan with an older man. What if she'd been right? What if something had happened to Michael that day that had erased everything that came after? What if this man was really Michael, but broken somehow, traumatized in ways I couldn't understand? Or what if he was someone else entirely, someone who'd studied my son's life the way a method actor studies a character? I couldn't know. I couldn't know any of it until those DNA results came back. And even then, even if the DNA said he was my son, what would that mean? Would I finally be able to trust him? Or would the doubts have taken root so deeply that I'd never be able to believe anything he said ever again? My late wife used to say that uncertainty was sometimes worse than bad news. "At least you know where you stand," she'd say. But I was beginning to understand that some uncertainties were designed to break you. Some mysteries were meant to destroy whatever peace you'd managed to build. And I was terrified that the next email from that lab would shatter the last fragile walls I'd constructed to keep myself sane. The email arrived at 9:47 a.m. on a Thursday. I was in my office staring at nothing when the notification popped up on my computer screen. Subject line, "Your DNA results are ready." I sat there for maybe 5 minutes without opening it, my cursor hovering over the link like I could freeze time by not clicking. Michael was downstairs making breakfast. I could hear him moving around, opening and closing cabinets. The smell of eggs and toast drifted up the stairwell. He was cooking breakfast like he belonged there. Like the answer I was about to get didn't matter. I thought about all those documents I'd found in his bag, the way he moved with too much familiarity, the warnings from David and Sharon. All of it came back to this moment. I clicked it. Paternity confirmed. Match probability, 99.7%. I read those words and felt the room tilt. There was no ambiguity. The test was clear. He was my son. The man downstairs making eggs in my kitchen was genetically, biologically my son. Every suspicion I'd cultivated, every log entry I'd written, all of it was wrong. Or not wrong exactly, but misdirected. I'd been right that something was off, but catastrophically wrong about what that meant. I closed the email and opened it again, checking to make sure it was from the right lab, verifying the reference numbers matched. Everything looked exactly the same, but everything was different. The confirmation I'd been waiting for had arrived, and instead of relief I felt panic. I felt all those logs, all those small moments I'd catalogued as deceptions, and it didn't matter. The DNA didn't care about my paranoia. He was my son. Biology didn't lie. He was in my house making breakfast, and I had no idea how to process that. My hands were shaking when I came downstairs. Michael looked up from the stove, spatula in hand. His expression changed from content to alert. He knew. "Robert," he said, and he used my first name, which he never did. He always called me Dad. Always had since that first night. "What's wrong? What happened?" I couldn't speak. I just stared at him. This man who looked like my son might look if the world hadn't taken him, if he'd been allowed to grow into his face, to weather naturally instead of being shaped by whatever had happened to him in those missing 28 years. This man who was my son. The genetic proof didn't make the doubt disappear. It just proved that doubt was possible even when you had all the evidence you needed, that the mind could convince itself of anything if given enough time and fear. "The results," I finally said. My voice sounded strange to me, like it belonged to someone else. "They came back." His spatula clattered into the sink. He turned off the heat. "And?" I walked to the kitchen table and pulled out a chair. I sat down slowly, aware of every joint, every movement. I was aware of my own body in a way I hadn't been in days. I could feel my heartbeat in my chest. I could feel the weight of all the questions I'd asked myself, all the things I'd doubted. "You're my son," I said. The words sounded hollow, like they belonged to someone else, like I was narrating something that was happening to another person. "The test confirms it. 99.7% match. You are genetically my son." I watched his face go through something complicated, something I couldn't quite categorize. Relief, yes, absolutely relief washed over his features, but also something like grief, like he'd been bracing himself for rejection, like he'd been waiting for me to reject him, and when I didn't, it broke him open in a way he hadn't been broken before. He sat down heavily in one of the kitchen chairs, the one Margaret used to sit in, the one I'd deliberately left empty since she died. He sat in it like he was collapsing. "Okay," he said. His voice was very small. "Okay, that's good, right? It should have been good. It should have been the moment where everything made sense, where I fell to my knees and wept for joy, where I held my son and we cried together about the years we'd lost, about the impossible distance that had just been erased by science and statistics. But I couldn't. The doubt had dug too deep, like roots into contaminated soil. I'd spent the last week cataloguing his lies and inconsistencies. I'd written them down. I'd studied them. I'd built a case against him in my own mind. And biology didn't erase any of that. Biology didn't explain why he'd asked about my insurance. Biology didn't explain the convenient way he knew where everything was in the house. Biology didn't explain the 3 a.m. phone calls. Biology didn't explain the man he'd become. I looked at him sitting there in Margaret's chair, looking smaller somehow now that he'd collapsed into it, and I felt something break inside me. Not anger, something worse. Resignation. The realization that even if he was my son, even if the test proved it, I might never be able to fully believe anything he told me again. The doubt had taken root. It had spread through me like a disease. "Tell me the truth," I said. "All of it. Not the story you've been telling me since Thursday night. Not the carefully structured narrative. The real story. Whatever it is, I need to hear it." He looked at me for a long time, his jaw clenched. The muscles in his face worked like he was trying to decide something, like he was weighing the consequences of honesty against the safety of silence. He ran his hands through his hair the way he did when he was stressed, pushing it back from his forehead, and that mannerism, that small specific tick, was exactly the way young Michael had done it when he was struggling with homework. The genes had passed down these tiny behavioural echoes across 28 years, these ghost movements of a boy I'd known. "If I tell you, you won't believe me anyway," he said quietly. His voice was different now, smaller, more real than any voice he'd used since he arrived. "You've already decided I'm lying. I can see it in your face. You just got confirmation that I'm your son, and it didn't make you trust me, it just made you trust me less." He was right. He was absolutely right. And I hated him for seeing that clearly. "Try me," I said anyway. He was quiet for another moment. I could hear the clock ticking on the kitchen wall, that clock I'd bought years ago, that Margaret had always complained was too loud. He seemed to be gathering himself, preparing for something. Then he started talking. Not the careful narrative he'd been feeding me since Thursday night when he arrived at my door, but something else entirely. Something that sounded raw and untethered, like he was speaking for the first time in years. He said he didn't remember the parking lot. Not clearly. He had fragments, sensations more than memories. A man's hand on his arm, the smell of cigarettes, a parking lot behind a convenience store, but nothing coherent, nothing he could verify. He said his earliest clear memories were from a motel room when he was maybe 12 or 13, but he had no idea how he got there, or how much time had passed. There was a man taking care of him. The man never hurt him in any obvious way. He fed him. He kept him clean. He told young Michael his name was David, and that his parents had died in an accident in Canada, and that David had promised to look after him. Michael had believed that story. He'd had no reason not to believe it. He'd lived in that story for 15 years until the man had gotten sick. The man was dying, Michael said. He had cancer. He was in a hospice facility for the last 3 months of his life, and he decided he needed to clear his conscience. He told me the truth about everything. The man's name wasn't David. He was a former teacher at Michael's school. He'd been obsessed with me, with my work, with my success. He'd seen Michael at school, something about the way Michael moved, the way he carried himself, and he'd become convinced that Michael was being neglected, that I was a terrible father, that Michael needed to be rescued. He'd followed Michael home from school that day in October. He'd approached him in the parking lot behind the convenience store. He'd asked Michael if he wanted to see something cool, and Michael, who was 12 and still innocent, who still trusted adults, had gone with him. "I think I knew something was wrong almost immediately," Michael said, "but I was too small to fight him, too young to understand what was happening. He drugged me that first night. I remember being in a car and feeling everything slowing down. I remember not being able to focus my eyes. After that, the memories get fuzzy." The man had taken Michael far away, to another province initially, then eventually across the border. He'd created a false identity for Michael. He'd created false documents. He'd told Michael that his real parents were dead, that the man had adopted him legally, that this was his life now. He'd used medication to keep Michael compliant. Sedatives mostly. Small doses mixed into food. Enough to make a young boy docile and suggestible. He'd raised Michael in a series of motels and small apartments across the country, moving every few years. Michael had gone to schools under different names, false names on forged documents that somehow never got questioned. He'd learned to be someone else. He'd learned to be the child of a man who wasn't his father. He'd learned to forget that he was ever Rob, Urchan's son. "I was told you were dead," Michael said. "I was told that you died when I was 6, that you were a bad man who'd hurt me, that forgetting you was necessary for me to be happy. He told me stories about you. Terrible stories. He painted this picture of a cruel engineer who didn't care about his wife or his son. He made sure I didn't want to remember." "When did you know that wasn't true?" I asked. "When I was maybe 16. A teacher mentioned something about the school, about how much my father had donated to the library. The man told the teacher that my father was dead. The teacher seemed confused. She asked my name, and she looked it up on her computer while I stood there. She said my real last name wasn't in any of our records. That got me thinking. After that, I started asking questions. The man changed my story. He said I was confused. He said my memory wasn't reliable. He said I'd suffered trauma that made me sometimes forget the difference between what was real and what I'd imagined. Michael said he'd tried to run away once when he was 17. He'd gotten as far as Winnipeg, maybe 3 hours from where we lived, before the police had found him. He hadn't known how to tell them who he was. He didn't even know his real name anymore. His whole identity was a fiction built on a foundation of lies. The man had come and got him. He'd told the police he was Michael's biological father. He had documents that looked legitimate, birth certificates, adoption papers, everything that would convince a police officer that this was an unfortunate situation involving a troubled, confused young man. And Michael hadn't fought it because he was terrified. He was terrified of the real world. He didn't know how to exist as himself. "I knew about the convenience store clerk," Michael said. "The woman who'd seen us that day. I'd actually asked him about her once, when I was older and starting to realize something was wrong. He told me she'd called the police, but that he'd been smart enough to disappear for a few years. He said he was careful. He said he'd been watching you, making sure you wouldn't find me. He said that he'd planned everything perfectly, that he was an expert at not being found." I listened to all of this and I felt the paranoia drain out of me like water out of a broken vessel. But it didn't leave me empty. It left me filled with something worse. Grief. Pure, all-consuming grief. Not for Michael's sudden appearance in my life, but for his actual life. For the childhood he'd lost. For the man he'd had to become in order to survive. For all the years we'd been separated by someone's delusion and cruelty. For the fact that whatever suspicions I'd harboured, whatever logs I'd compiled, the real story was so much darker than anything I'd imagined. I'd been paranoid about the wrong things. I'd been protecting myself from the wrong threat. The man who'd taken him, this person who'd called himself David, was already dead. He'd died in a hospice facility somewhere in British Columbia. He'd taken his obsession with me, his conviction that he was saving Michael from a terrible father, his entire delusional framework to his grave, and Michael had been left alone to deal with the aftermath. "Why didn't you just tell me this from the beginning?" I asked. My voice sounded tired. "When you first showed up at my door?" "Because I wasn't sure you'd believe me," he said. "Because I wasn't sure I deserved to be believed. Because I spent 28 years being someone else, and I didn't know if the man you'd create in your head from that story would be someone you could love. I thought if I just seemed normal enough, seemed like your son, you might let me stay long enough to figure out how to tell you the truth. I was going to tell you. I swear I was. But then you looked at me like you were trying to decide if I was a threat, and I got scared. I reverted. I went back to trying to present myself the way I thought you'd want me to be. He was right. I had looked at him that way. I'd spent the last week treating him like a threat, cataloguing his behaviours, looking for deceptions, and he'd felt that suspicion and had responded to it by becoming more deceptive, which only confirmed my suspicions. It was a feedback loop of distrust and fear. I realised then that some of my suspicions had been right, but for completely wrong reasons. He had been gathering information about my finances, yes, but not because he wanted to con me out of my life insurance money or manipulate me for some elaborate scheme. He'd been trying to figure out if I could afford to support him, if there were resources we could access, if there were trust funds or educational funds or anything that might help him integrate back into a normal life. He'd been trying to understand if I had the means to give him what he desperately needed, which was therapy, stability, and a foundation upon which to rebuild an identity that had been shattered and reconstructed so many times he didn't know who he actually was anymore. I sat down heavily in the chair opposite him, and for a long time we just sat together in silence. The eggs he'd been cooking were cold on the stove. The toast was congealing on the plate. Everything that had seemed normal and domestic just 10 minutes ago now felt fragile and temporary. I thought about the boy I'd lost and the man he'd become. I thought about the 28 years that separated us like an ocean. I thought about how impossible it was to ever get those years back, to fill that gap with anything but grief. I thought about Margaret and how she would have handled this with more grace than I was managing. I thought about grief and love and how they were sometimes the same thing, two sides of the same coin, inseparable. "I'm sorry," Michael said. His voice was small and broken, for lying, for manipulating you, for all of it, for not being straightforward from the beginning. "You deserved better than that. You don't have anything to be sorry for," I said. "You were a victim. You are a victim. None of this was your fault. None of it." "So are you," he said quietly. "You're a victim too. You lost your son. You've been grieving him for 28 years, and now I'm here, and I'm not the son you lost because that boy's gone. I'm someone else, and I know that's not fair to you." That was the moment I understood how broken this situation really was. This man, this stranger who shared my DNA, who looked like my son might have looked, who had lived through an unspeakable trauma that he was only beginning to process, understood that his presence here was painful for me. He understood that my real son, the boy I'd mourned for nearly 3 decades, was gone, that I would never get him back, that this man could only ever be a pale shadow of what I'd lost. That night, we talked for hours, not about reconciliation or healing or any of the things therapy would later encourage us to work toward. We just talked about the basic facts of his life. He told me about the different names he'd lived under, the schools he'd attended, the ways the man had systematically tried to make him forget who he really was. He told me about foster care after the man died, about the social workers who didn't know what to do with a 28-year-old who didn't have an identity. He told me about sitting in that motel room for weeks, reading newspaper articles about missing persons cases, learning about the internet and technology that had advanced so far beyond anything he'd ever encountered. I told him about the years after he disappeared, about the missing person cases that went nowhere, about the detectives who eventually stopped calling because they had no new leads, about how his mother had searched for him until the day she got sick, about how I'd waited for him for 28 years, always hoping, never quite believing he was coming home. I told him about the guilt, the way I'd blame myself for not being watchful enough, not being careful enough, not being the father he needed. I told him that his mother had blamed herself too, and that we'd never quite forgiven ourselves for failing to protect him. We cried. Not the way I'd imagined we would if he ever came home. This wasn't cathartic or healing, this was just grief being acknowledged. We didn't hug because that felt too big, too much, like we'd be pretending that we actually knew each other. But we sat close, closer than we'd been able to sit since he arrived, and we let each other grieve the impossible distance between us. The distance that biology had bridged but that nothing else could quite close. We were bound by blood and loss and trauma, but those bonds couldn't erase the fact that we were essentially strangers. In the days that followed, I set up therapy for him. A professional who specialised in trauma and identity and the specific kind of psychological damage that comes from being kidnapped and raised in isolation. I called Detective Wells and told her everything. She came to the house, and I watched Michael relive his story for her, watching it become evidence instead of narrative. She helped us navigate the legal and bureaucratic complications, The man who'd taken Michael was dead, so there was no prosecution possible, but there was something in naming what had happened, in speaking it aloud to authorities, in making sure there was a record. There was a small measure of justice in that acknowledgement. Michael decided to stay. Not because everything was suddenly okay between us, not because the distance had somehow collapsed. He decided to stay because we both needed to try. We were strangers bound by blood and loss, and I had no idea if we could actually build a relationship out of that foundation. But I knew I had to try. He was my son. The test had confirmed it. And even if I couldn't forgive myself for the years I'd failed to protect him, even if I couldn't rebuild what had been taken, I could at least be present. I kept the logs I'd written. I kept that list of suspicious behaviours and concerning moments. Weeks later, I looked at it and felt ashamed of my suspicions. I felt ashamed that I'd been documenting his movements like he was a threat instead of a victim. But other times, I felt validated that something had indeed been wrong, even if I'd misdiagnosed what that something was. The truth was more complex than the paranoia had suggested. The real danger wasn't in his lies about my insurance. The real danger had already passed, had already done its damage 28 years ago. 3 months later, Michael got his GED. He'd never finished high school, never been allowed to have a normal education. He spent weeks preparing and passed on his first attempt. 6 months later, he started attending community college. He wanted to study social work, wanted to help other people who'd been trafficked or traumatized or lost the way he had been. I watched him build a life from nothing, and I saw traces of the boy I'd lost in the man he was becoming. Not the exact same person, but something of that original Michael living on in this person's determination to find meaning in suffering. But there was always a distance, a small persistent space between us that couldn't quite be bridged. He'd been raised by someone else. He'd learned to think like someone else. He'd become someone else over the course of nearly 3 decades, and even though the DNA said he was my son, some part of him would always be a stranger to me. I'd mourned him when he was taken. I'd mourned him again when he was returned. We were both learning what it meant to be a family when family had become theoretical, something that only existed in genetics and memory and the ghost of what might have been. On his first birthday after he came home, I made his favourite meal. Or what I remembered to be his favourite meal from when he was a child. Sandwiches with peanut butter and jam on white bread, the rectangles cut just the way he'd preferred them when he was 8 years old. Margaret had always indulged that preference, always made sure his sandwiches were cut into rectangles instead of triangles. He cried when he saw them sitting on the plate. I don't know if he actually remembered preferring rectangles, or if he was just crying because someone had tried to recreate a moment from his childhood, some evidence that he'd been loved and known before everything changed. Either way, those sandwiches represented everything I couldn't repair. The boy he'd been was gone forever. He'd been replaced by a man shaped by trauma and loss, and 28 years of living under false identities. But he was alive, he was here, he was trying. And maybe that was enough. Not the perfect reunion I'd imagined for 28 years, not the Hollywood ending where a father and son find their way back to each other and everything makes sense, but something real, something broken and incomplete, but genuine. Something that could be built on gradually, with patience and therapy and the small kindnesses of 2 people trying to love each other across the impossible distance of time and pain. That was my son. Not the boy who disappeared all those years ago, but the man who came home. And perhaps that was how loss worked. It wasn't just about what you'd lost. It was about learning to love what remained, even when what remained was broken and uncertain, and nothing like what you'd imagined. I would spend the rest of my life getting to know the son I'd lost, and he would spend the rest of his life learning to be my son again, and maybe eventually we'd find a way to make that work. Maybe not completely, maybe not the way we would have if life had been different, but maybe somehow we could learn to be a family, not the family we were supposed to be, but the family we actually were, and that would have to be enough.